Hi there, my Why Religion friends. Professor Anthony Sweat here from BYU Religious Education. Welcome to another great episode of Why Religion. A few weeks ago, I was in upstate New York on a church history trip. And as part of that trip, on Sunday, after we went to church, I might add, we went to visit Niagara Falls. And when I arrived, I just couldn't believe how busy it was for a Sunday afternoon. The sheer number of people there amazed me as much as the falls itself almost. While I was observing all these people, I had a thought cross my mind along the lines of, this day seems no different than an extended Saturday for most of these people. And as I had that somewhat critical thought, another thought crossed my mind, and it went something like this: and you're guilty as charged with the rest in this crowd, buddy. And perhaps my thoughts were right. Perhaps they were wrong. Even as I tell you this story, some of you who are listening may be thinking, oh good, he went to church on Sunday, even on a trip. Others of you might be thinking, what? He went to Niagara Falls on a Sunday? That's so inappropriate for the Sabbath. Well, somebody else might come back to that and say, well, he was worshiping by appreciating the creations of God in nature. And while somebody else might just say, hey, it's his business, leave him alone. And therein, my friends, enters the difficulty of the command to remember the Sabbath day and to keep it holy. While many commandments are fairly clear, particularly the thou shalt nots, how to exactly keep the command to remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy has been debated for millennia, and it extends and continues today. Apart from attending our church meetings, it can sometimes be hard to know where to draw lines of do's and don'ts for the Sabbath day. Even our neighbors who worship side by side with us in the morning at church have differing views on the appropriateness of certain activities in the afternoon and the evening at home. Judging one another inappropriately is clearly an error, but seeking to judge appropriate Sabbath approaches for ourselves is clearly essential. Professor Gaye Strathearn from BYU's Department of Ancient Scripture has recently published an insightful article examining what modern Latter-day Saints might learn about Sabbath worship from Israelites in the late Second Temple period. That's the time just before and just after Christ. She talks about why these conversations are helpful.
I think the conversation is good. I think conversation today, is healthy. And it's healthy because it helps us take seriously and think seriously about the Sabbath. We can't be passive in our observance of the Sabbath. This has to be a choice, and it's an ongoing choice. And honestly, just as there were different opinions of how to do that in the late Second Temple period, I think that's also important here.
In today's episode, get ready to learn from the struggles to navigate the Sabbath day by Israelites in the late Second Temple period, and how we can learn from them to continue to remember and keep the Sabbath day holy for ourselves today. This is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind.
Recently, Professor Casey Griffiths sat down with his ancient scripture colleague, Professor Gaye Strathearn, to discuss her research publication called Remembering and Keeping the Sabbath Day in the Late Second Temple Period, What Modern Latter-day Saints Might Learn About Sabbath Worship. In part one, she will talk about why she did this study and take us back to 200 BC to discuss how there were different ways to interpret and navigate the general command of keeping the Sabbath day holy from the vastly varied cultural context of the Old Testament, where the command was given, versus the world of the New Testament that Jesus will enter into, helping us see how Jesus is entering into an ongoing discussion about the Sabbath. In part two, like normal, she'll move a little bit more toward why this study matters, discussing some principles of the Sabbath day. How do we not give lists of do's and don'ts, but still make the Sabbath an important sign of our covenant with God? And in part three, Professor Strathearn will talk a little bit more personally, telling us about her own academic training, what led her to BYU, and why she chooses faith in her own unique situations and context. So here is Dr. Griffiths interviewing Dr. Gaye Strathearn.
Gaye, thanks for meeting with us today. And the piece that we're discussing is called Remembering and Keeping the Sabbath Day in the Late Second Temple Period, What Modern Latter-day Saints Might Learn About Sabbath Worship. And I want to start out with, you open with this really interesting insight, which is, it seems like the concept of a Sabbath day has been lessening in importance among all people, even Latter-day Saints. For instance, you quote this, a 2016 Deseret News poll found that in 38 years from 1978 to 2016, the personal importance of the Sabbath day to the average American has dropped by 24 percentage points.
Yeah, that's huge, isn't it?
That's really huge. What factors do you think are causing that, or why is that happening?
That's a really good question, and I think it's not just any one factor, but there's a lot of factors. I mean, I think generally in America and around the world, we're getting less religious or less organized religion. And so there's also way more competing things to do on the Sabbath with sport and stores open and Amazon's 7-day-a-week delivery and all of those kind of things. So I just think that there's competing institutions and things that are after our time and our energy, and that they take us away.
And it seems like there's a generational shift to this. One of the statistics you cite also said that a 2016 poll found that only 41% of millennials consider Sunday to have any religious meaning.
Right. And again, I think that that's a kind of a movement away from organized religion. Mm-hmm. It's a personal thing. I have a personal relationship with God. I don't need an organized religion to help me with that. And I'm sure that has at least some impact on this.
One last statistic here. In contrast, the poll indicated that 83% of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints answered that Sunday does have particular religious or spiritual meaning for them. And the other end of the spectrum, only 38% of Jews answered the question affirmatively, with Sunday being replaced with Saturday in the question. So it seems like to Latter-day Saints, the Sabbath is still a big deal, or at least there's a healthy percentage that believe so.
Yeah, but it still hasn't stopped our church leaders wanting to re-emphasize the Sabbath, and that suggests to me that at least in their mind there has been a shift away even amongst Latter-day Saints, and I think that can be a lot of different things, but again, competing ideas. Is it okay to attend church and then just go to the football game, and what constitutes a Sabbath and what constitutes worship, and this is a command that is 2 millennia old, right? And so how can the relevance of something given to Moses have relevance for us in our day, which is a very, very different environment in which we live?
Well, and as I read your research here, I found myself realizing that some of the things that they did to try and pin down the exactness of the Sabbath, I do. For instance, you mentioned Amazon is open 24/7, yeah. And I've had conversations with my family about, is it okay to order stuff on Amazon? Is that shopping? And we even got down to, well, Amazon ships after 3 p.m. So if you order after 3 p.m., you're not making anybody work. You're just clicking a button. It seems like what these people did anciently, we still do today, where we try and find every possible loophole we can to get around the Sabbath day.
Well, we could think about it in terms of loopholes, but this is one of the reasons why I did this research, is because I was really interested in the New Testament and the Sabbath controversies there. Mm-hmm. And I'm always a little concerned when we pinhole individuals or groups of people as one-dimensional figures. And I think that happens in the New Testament, right? Jesus is good. Well, that's always true, right? Pharisees are bad. Yeah, I'm not sure that that's always true. And so what I was trying to do is try and understand what the world was like and how people, what are they thinking about Sabbath in that period. And so the late Second Temple period is from about 200 BC to about 70 AD. Yeah. And so what's going on there that might help me better understand what's happening in the New Testament. And I found it fascinating, right? As I studied this and looked at it, and as you said, I see a lot of connections between what they're trying to do there. They're not trying to make complicated lists that seem too long and too specific and too legalistic. That's not what they're trying to do. What I think they're trying to do is, in a world that is like us, very different than the one found in the Old Testament, right? Even for them, the command was 1,500 years old by the time that they're dealing with it. And again, their situation was very different, right? It's one thing for Moses to give a command like this when you're living in a theocratic state where you're ruled by a prophet or even by a king and a prophet. But by the time that we're having here, we've got very different outside forces. You're not living in that kind of environment. You're ruled by foreign powers that have political, social, economic impact on you that is going to impact your religious practice as well. And so what I see them doing here is not something what I would consider negative. This is something where they're struggling with the same questions that we are. How do I keep this Sabbath day alive and vibrant and relevant in our day? And so, like we are. Right?
I have to admit I was struck by some parallels. For instance, during this time, the Jews go from being an independent nation to being a kind of a subpopulation within this larger population, the Roman Empire. Kind of like how Latter-day Saints, for a brief period there, were a pretty much independent nation in the 19th century and then became a subculture within a large empire, the American nation. If the Second Late Temple period is 200 BC to AD 70, I think most of our audience will know a lot about the AD period after Jesus was born. But the fact that we don't use books like Maccabees means we might have a lack of knowledge about what happened in 200 BC. Yeah. Can you fill us in a little bit on the geopolitical situation? In fact, let me do that again because I bumped this. Can you fill us in a little bit on the situation that the Jewish people find themselves in and why they may have become so concerned about Sabbath worship and maintaining it?
Sure. By 200 BC, we have the Greeks are in control, so we're getting a Hellenistic world. And it's Alexander the Great is dead and his kingdom has been divided up by various of his generals. And one of those generals in particular, so we're looking at the beginning of the 2nd century, he's, you've got to remember that Judea is a very, very small, almost insignificant place, right? But he's trying to go through and he's trying to get unity in his empire. And one of the ways that he wants unity is to have unity in religious practice. And so he's going to go in according to the Maccabean literature and he's going to outlaw Judaism. Right? So that's going to include Sabbath activities or circumcision or going to the temple and those kinds of things. And so what Judaism finds themselves in is, how do we survive in this world and not lose our identity, right? Moses said that they were to be, or God said through Moses, that they were to be a peculiar people, that they were supposed to stand out. But how do we do this in an environment, a political and cultural and economic environment that's trying to get rid of our uniqueness and make us be absorbed by the more dominant culture? All right, and Jews themselves were struggling with this idea. Frankly, the Maccabean literature says that some people were really gung-ho at saying, okay, we need to be yuppies. I don't know if that's a word people use anymore.
The Roman Empire equivalent of yuppies.
Well, this is Greek at this point, but yes, right? And so we want to be progressive. We want to do all of these Hellenistic things. We want the philosophies. We want the gymnasiums. We want all of these kinds of things. And they're saying, let's do it. Let's step up. We've been on the outside long enough. It's time for us to be a part of this culture. And so there's one side, there's these favourable things, but the other group are saying, no, what's that going to do to us? Are we going to lose our identity? How can we live in this world but still continue to thrive in the world? And so there's this debate going on within Judaism, right? What is it about Judaism that is absolutely central to our beliefs and our identity? So if we gave up on these, we would cease to exist. And they came up with a number of them, but one of those was the Sabbath day. And there are other things that we can compromise on, right, so that we can still live within this environment. But that Sabbath becomes this identity marker. If we give up on this, we cease to exist. And so that becomes important. And we see that conversation going on within the text, but we also see it in non-Jewish texts, so Greek and Roman texts, where they're recognizing that this Sabbath day is this identity marker. And for sometimes they're okay. In some Roman leaders are going to give Jews special concessions because of the Sabbath day, right? You haven't got to be in the military. You haven't got to do all of these things because that would encroach on your Sabbath activities. And they're even saying to people, don't interfere with their Sabbath practices. But then on the other hand, we get this Antiochus saying, yeah, no, it's forbidden by law, penalty of death if you're found doing it. And so trying to navigate these environment was, I think, difficult for them.
Well, and some of the ways that they navigated it, I found really fascinating. For instance, there's a conversation in here that you note where they talk about, is it okay to fight on the Sabbath day?
Yeah.
And there's an instance where you cite about 1,000 people are killed because they refuse to defend themselves on the Sabbath day, and that the compromise that they kind of reach is that it's okay to fight defensively, but they wouldn't launch any offensives.
Yeah.
They wouldn't start the fights, but if the fight came to them, they would fight. That's a fascinating angle that I've never even really thought about before.
Okay, so part of that is because, frankly, the Old Testament really gives us very, very limited instructions of what the Sabbath day means and how do you live it. Right? And so there's a lot of there's not even a lot of thou shalt nots, right, to do it. But nowhere in the Old Testament does it talk about or give any direction on whether you should fight on the Sabbath, right? So this isn't a place where we can go to the scriptural text and say, oh, here's the answer. Of course, there's a lot of fighting going on in the Old Testament, but they're not addressing Sabbath day. So as this group is trying to come to terms and take the very limited information that the Hebrew Bible gives, we find that their lists start to expand and grow because what was in the Bible was not sufficient for their everyday needs. And so Jubilees is one of the ones that includes in their expanding list going to war, right? But other texts don't mention it at all. So again, we see that different communities are answering this in different ways for it. So we've got this Jubilees saying you shouldn't go to war. And that's how we come up with the Maccabean, right? People are willing to die rather than break the Sabbath day. That's how important Sabbath is for them. Mm-hmm. But then the Maccabean literature is a really nice window, and we don't get a lot of windows in seeing the development of ideas, right? So, Jubilee says don't go to war, all right? So people are dying. And then the community's having to think, okay, is this the right interpretation? If we continue to live like this, and we know that our enemies know that we keep the Sabbath day and we interpret it this way, and they're targeting us specifically on the Sabbath to give themselves a military advantage, then we lose 1,000 people in this war and we lose 1,000 here and 1,000 more. What's going to happen to the Sabbath day? How is it going to be an eternal, perpetual covenant if there's no one left, right? And so what do we have to do to adjust this so that in our circumstances, the Sabbath day can continue to be important, it can continue to be lived, and to do that, then we've got to make some changes. So we see the flexibility of this, and I think that that's really important over time. The Sabbath may have been written on tablets of stones, but the only reason it survived is that it's its ability to be flexible according to the people and their needs and times across time and space.
Now, we've talked about warfare on the Sabbath day. What were some other areas of interest that they were trying to negotiate what the right thing to do was and how to observe the Sabbath day?
Okay, well, that's a great question, but they're going to start with what the Hebrew Bible tells us, right? So as we look at, even in the Hebrew Bible, we see some things changing over time. So if we're looking in the 5 books of Moses, we're getting kind of four main prohibitions, right? So one of them is that they're not to collect manna, right? Mm-hmm. Well, by the time of the Second Temple period, there hasn't been manna for over 1,000 years. So what do we do with that? Is manna going to, is it a so in other words, do we throw that one out or do we reinterpret it? And do we say, okay, we're talking here about food in general. Prepare your food before the Sabbath day. But one of the difficulties with that is the Israelites weren't just eating manna at this time. They were eating quail as well. But there's absolutely nothing in the Hebrew Bible that prohibits going and collecting quail on the Sabbath day. Mm-hmm. So is it just manna or is it food in general? And as they're going through that, they're kind of coming to the idea that they're going to interpret it in terms of food in general. But then they're going to expand it, right? So it's one thing to talk about food, but what about water? And so we're seeing different ways of interpreting. Okay, so we've got to collect water before the Sabbath day. And part of that is because for most ancient communities, they had to travel distances to collect the water and bring it in. And so how far is it okay to walk to get water or to do things? Those also come into play in trying to do things. But all of these times they're just saying, how can I make the Sabbath real and alive to me and in what I'm doing? So then they're going to do like gathering sticks. Can you gather sticks on the Sabbath? And why is gathering sticks or lighting a fire a big deal? And so they're going to, some people say, well, won't even mention it. Others will say, yes, this is still important. Some people will try and explain why you can't light a fire. Others just go, I have no idea, so we're just going to include it because it's in the biblical record. But then they're going to expand it into other ways as well. It's not just what you do, but what are you thinking about? What are you talking about? So if the Sabbath is a day of rest, and that we shouldn't do any work, can we think about work? Can we talk about work? What am I going to do tomorrow and how am I going to get through these kinds of things? Or is it something where it is a holy day and so we think only of holy things? So those kind of discussions are also coming up.
So interesting. And again, as you talk, there's so many parallels where I'm thinking about our day and how these discussions are taking place in a modern context, but they're really kind of the same thing.
Absolutely.
You know, do I prepare food today would be, is it okay to go to a restaurant? Is it okay to light a fire? Is it okay to do homework on the Sabbath and things like that we kind of grapple with?
But for us, maybe lighting a fire isn't a big deal, right? But what would be the interpretation of that in our day, right? So one of my colleagues, Avram Shannon, one of the things he asks his student is, when he's talking about these issues, is, so is it okay to get food from a vending machine on the Sabbath, right? You're paying money, right? Is that an issue? You're not making anyone work and things. And he talks about how interesting the conversation is in class. And one of the things that he wants to point out, you have now just started engaging in halakha. You're doing exactly what the Jews are trying to do during this time period to see, is this what's appropriate and what isn't appropriate given our circumstances?
Well, and we tend to vilify this kind of practice because of the New Testament and the way the Savior reacts to maybe overdoing it when it comes to the Sabbath day. But what's the value you see in having those kinds of discussions about the whole, can we use a vending machine on Sunday? Like, is that helpful, or is that us looking beyond the mark, or how is that, how should that happen in our time?
Well, I think I want to come back to your statement about Jesus first. So Jesus is entering into an ongoing discussion about Sabbath, right? In the Second Temple period, there is no normative that everybody agrees on ways to think about or live the Sabbath. There are conversations going on. And in some ways, Jesus is entering into that ongoing conversation. Certainly, he has authority in ways, and that's an important issue to do. But frankly, sometimes he agrees with some of this conversation, and sometimes he doesn't, right? But he's entering into the conversation. So I think the conversation is good. I think conversation today, I think, is healthy. And it's healthy because it helps us take seriously and think seriously about the Sabbath. We can't be passive in our observance of the Sabbath. This has to be a choice, and it's an ongoing choice. And honestly, just as there were different opinions of how to do that in the late Second Temple period, I think that that's also important here.
If you're interested in more peer-reviewed, high-quality gospel scholarship about Latter-day Saint history, doctrine, or scripture, like this article, BYU's Religious Studies Center is a great place for you to check out. Here, I typically advertise one of their recent publications or products, but this time, I'm going to do something a little bit different. I want to update you on some recent changes in leadership at the RSC and in BYU Religion. Dan Judd, who was the Dean of Religious Education, recently retired as of the summer of 2021. When the idea of this podcast was proposed a few years ago, Dean Judd was instrumental in supporting the concept and helping it get going, knowing the good that it could do. And I'm deeply grateful to him for all he has done for religious education. We will have Dean Judd on an upcoming episode that he recorded before he retired, by the way. In Dr. Judd's place, Scott Esplin was recently appointed as the Dean of Religious Education. Dr. Esplin was the publications director at the Religious Studies Center prior to this appointment, and he also was one of the early supporters of this podcast and helped with the collaboration with the RSC to start this podcast. Dr. Esplin will be a great blessing for BYU Religious Education. And finally, to close the domino loop, Dr. Jared Ludlow was recently announced to replace Dr. Esplin as the new publications director at BYU's Religious Studies Center. Dr. Ludlow will no doubt further the important mission of the RSC to bring you faithful gospel and academic scholarship regarding the history, doctrine, and teachings of the church for you to check out and pick up at rsc.byu.edu. Okay, we've been listening to Professor Gaye Strathearn discuss her recent publication, Remembering and Keeping the Sabbath Day in the Late Second Temple Period, What Modern Latter-day Saints Might Learn About Sabbath Worship. In part 2 of Why Religion, we typically move a little bit more toward application, exploring why this publication could matter to the everyday saint to help them live, learn, and apply the restored gospel of Jesus Christ. Many of us are aware of President Russell M. Nelson's teaching that rather than getting caught up in lists of do's and don'ts on the Sabbath, that our conduct and attitude on the Sabbath constitute a sign that we offer to God of our covenant relationship with Him. Sister Strathearn will pick up here with a related story to this vital teaching.
A number of years ago, a few of us were invited to come up to the Area Authority Coordinating Council, something like that, to talk about the Sabbath day. And so this is when I started thinking about this, right? So there were members of the 12, of the presidency of the 70, the presiding bishopric, but they were all asking these questions. They wanted to learn about the Sabbath and what's happening. And I remember the discussions afterwards is that we don't want to, as a church, give us lists of thou shalts and thou shalt nots, but how do we help the saints recognize just how important this Sabbath is? How do we teach it in a way that is going to be meaningful to them? And one of the things that we discussed and that we see in the Second Temple period is Exodus 31's view that the Sabbath is about covenant and it's about the sign of the covenant. And so the question then that we talked about, and I've thought a lot about, is that how should I personally decide how I should live my Sabbath? Well, I think that that's going to be reflective of how I understand and how important my covenant is to me, because it's still a sign of our covenants. And all of us are going to be at different places on journey along that way. And we have to allow, I think, that people learn and grow in their understanding of the Sabbath as well. So how I choose to do it in my life might not be exactly the same as how you choose to do it in your life with your family, but that's okay, right? Because we're trying to think about it in terms of we let the covenant be our guiding principle rather than a list of things to do or don't do, I think is really important. So let me give you an example. So when I was I grew up, my dad wasn't a member of the church. And in some ways, the Sabbath day was really hard on him because in some ways the church took his family away from him. This was in the day before consolidated meetings. And so we'd go to church in the morning, we'd come home at lunch, we'd go back to church in the evenings. State conferences were, a couple of hours away. We were gone all day and things like that. And so my dad was very different from what we were involved in. But my dad was a fisherman and he loved to fish and he was part of a fishing club. And so once a year, at Christmas time, his club would have a barbecue, a Christmas barbecue, where all of the families were involved, right, and invited. And in my narrow interpretation of the Sabbath, I was kind of very, I can't do that. I got to go to church. I can't do that. That would be breaking the Sabbath. That's not good. And so I was a bit of a pill, actually, and I made this difficult on my dad. And it's not that we were going to the beach to play or swim. We were sitting around, eating, talking, those kinds of things. And I am grateful that my dad lived long enough for me to grow in my understanding of the Sabbath, to understand going to that for me is a way of honouring my covenant, not breaking it. Because here was my father, and if I spent one Sabbath a year with him doing something he wanted, I don't think that's breaking the Sabbath. Right? Now, I'm not advocating that we shouldn't go to church or we should spend our time at the beach or those kind of things, but in that circumstance, I think it became important for me to do. And I'm so glad that I came to that realization before it was too late, right?
So if a person was trying to apply what you're saying here, the question they would ask themselves is, how do I honor the covenant?
Yeah.
Because right alongside the Sabbath day is honor thy father and thy mother.
Yes.
And you felt like your father maybe didn't, in keeping one commandment, you were disobeying another because your dad felt excluded when it comes down to it. It is a tendency that we sometimes have to make lists of do's and don'ts. And I found out as a young teacher, I thought when I taught my Sabbath day lesson, I just put the do's and don'ts. And I realized after my first class doing that was like throwing a hand grenade into the middle of the audience, that it's such a deeply personal and sometimes familial cultural thing that it's difficult to give a list of do's and don'ts. So one principle would be, what can I do to honor the covenant? Are there other principles that you think would be helpful for Latter-day Saints to kind of put into their hearts when it comes to their approach to the Sabbath day?
Yeah. So one of my studying is that I didn't want to just focus on what we can't do. I wanted to make sure to try and understand what the positive things were that people were doing in the Sabbath in antiquity. And again, this is part of the process kind of going through, but we have indications that they wanted to gather together. Gathering on the Sabbath was important. To gather to read scriptures, to talk about scriptures, to increase their understanding of scriptures. It was important for them to go and to participate with others in liturgical prayer. Now, we don't use that quite as much today, but that idea of praying together as one. Prayers in that kind of fashion are very different than personal prayers. Personal prayers are often, Heavenly Father, this is what I need, right? And so it's immediate, the here and now, whereas liturgical prayers are often times where we're gathering together and we're praying to give praise to God, to thank Him for the bounties of His and the blessings in our lives, and we do that as not just as individuals but as a community. And then there's the hymns, the singing of hymns together, and the wonderful thing that does, not just in terms of connecting with God, so the vertical connections, but these much broader horizontal connections with each other, that we're part of a community, that we gather strength from each other as we're doing that. And honestly, I've thought a lot about that as we've been through this COVID experience, where some of those things have been challenged. So for me, as a single person, so it's all well and good to say, so we're doing home-centered church and everything's there. And that works for most people in the church. But for me, that was really, really difficult in a pandemic. Mm-hmm. So I'm at home all day by myself. I don't get to go to church anymore, so I don't get the strength of the fellow saints there. I don't get to pray with them, to sing with them, and all of the tremendously spiritual things that does for me as an individual. And so that for me kind of highlighted something that I've taken for granted because I've just done it all of this time. But now when it's taken away from me, and just realizing what a powerful impact that can have on my spirituality in the present, but also the ongoing growth that it happens as an individual. And I hope if something good comes out of this pandemic, one of those will be that not that, I'm used to not going to church on the Sunday, so I'm not going to go back, but how much I've missed the power of that gathering that comes from the Sabbath.
It does seem like the pandemic we've dealt with recently has caused us to rethink the Sabbath day and what it means to worship and not worship. Because at first, I think everybody was sort of, hey, church is canceled. But then the question became, how do you still make the Sabbath different from every other day if you're not going to church? What is it that we have to do personally and devotionally? I love this quote that you included in your article from Judith Shulevitz. Yep. I hope I said that right. She said, most people mistakenly believe that all you have to do to stop working is not work. The inventors of the Sabbath rules understood that it was a much more complicated undertaking. You cannot downshift casually and easily the way you might slip into bed at the end of a long day. The Sabbath rules did not exist to torture the faithful. They were meant to communicate the insight that interpreting the ceaseless round of striving requires a surprisingly strenuous act of will, one that has to be bolstered by the habit as well as by social sanction. Only a Sabbath that you have to work for will appear worth keeping. Talk a little bit about that, the idea that the Sabbath, that not working is work, that it takes work to not work.
Well, I think that's really important. It's getting the idea that this can't be a passive thing. And that's why I didn't want to emphasize totally on thou shalt nots, right? That I wanted to make sure we saw and understood the positive aspects of the Sabbath and that we're seeking to do.
One of the most provocative things you brought up was this question of thinking of holy things. Now, you're a religion professor, and so you think of holy things all the time. What's the boundary between work and worship for you on the Sabbath? Like, if you're writing a paper like this on the Sabbath, does that count as holy worship? Or?
Well, that's part of the discussion, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Because I think about, so are there some things that I do that are appropriate for the Sabbath and some things that are work-related, and trying to make that distinction in time. So this isn't just a continuation of my everyday life. And I don't know that I've come up with a perfect answer for that. I guess if I'm going to say it, I'm going to say, well, what are my church calling writings that I can do, right? Mm-hmm. So that in a sense, I'm not being paid for these things, mm-hmm. right? So that I can dedicate it to doing things to help build the kingdom in a devotional type of way.
How would you talk to one of your students? Because I had a student yesterday say, I do all my homework for your class on Sunday. And I didn't quite know how to feel about that. I felt like, oh, am I making them work? Or should I be more strict about saying that? But part of their work is reading the scriptures for the classes that we teach.
Yeah. I think we have to be really, really careful about putting do's and don'ts, right? This is part of that. That, again, people are going to develop over time and their understanding. And what is right for me at my time in life isn't necessarily what's right for somebody else in a different place and spot in their time. And so I think we celebrate all of the ways that people in the variety of their lives are willing to actively think about the Sabbath, right? And I mean, honestly, how we do things Sabbath day in America isn't going to be the same way that members of the church necessarily do things in other countries in the world. We can't even think of it in terms of it being Sunday, right? Because in some places, church meets together, their Sabbath is Saturday, it's Friday. In some places in the world, it's every day of the week, depending on when you can get off work to do that. And so I think, understanding that this is a living, breathing, and in some ways fluid commandment, that if we make it too static, we break ourselves and it, rather than allowing ways for it to bless our lives and increase the horizontal relationship we have with God, and the vertical relationship we have with God, and that horizontal life relationship we have with other saints, as we're also looking for our own community identity in a world that is increasingly seeking to sideline or take away the importance of a Sabbath day. And so this isn't something just for Latter-day Saints. This is Christians and Jews everywhere thinking that this is something that's worth fighting for, rather than allowing outside forces to absorb us into the world, just as the Jews were experiencing in the late Second Temple period.
If you want to read Professor Strathearn's article called Remembering and Keeping the Sabbath Day in the Late Second Temple Period, What Modern Latter-day Saints Might Learn About Sabbath Worship, go to whyreligion.byu.edu, where we have placed a link to download that article. There you can get access to past episodes and their available articles also, and learn more about the professors who have been featured on this podcast. And while I have you, if you love the show but haven't yet left us a review on your podcast platform, please do so, as it helps in the promoting algorithm so that others who might enjoy this podcast that haven't yet heard of it can be exposed to it. We're so grateful to all of those who have left great 5-star ratings to help promote and share this podcast so broadly with others so that they can be benefited by the great work being done by the BYU Religion faculty. All right, we've arrived at the last part of Why Religion, where we like to talk a little bit about the professor's own academic journey and faith. So here's Gaye Strathearn giving us a little background on her journey to BYU and why she chooses to be a person of faith.
Let's shift gears for a minute, and I want to talk about your personal experience. You've hinted at things here, like your dad wasn't a member of the church, and then you said, hey, when we went to state conference, it was several hours away. Gaye, you grew up in an area outside of kind of the typical Latter-day Saint culture region. Tell us a little bit about your experience to grow up in a family that was part member and in an area where the church was still being established.
Yeah, it was really small, right? So my mother and grandmother joined the church in 1958. Actually, my mother's best friend and her husband had joined it sometime before that, and she was so excited about the gospel, and Mother thought she was crazy, frankly. But one day the missionaries came and knocked on Mum's door and then Nana's door, who was not very far away, and they let them in. Mum thought that her friend had sent them, but they hadn't. They'd just been out tracting. My grandmother was ready almost immediately to be baptized, but Mum wasn't. the Joseph Smith story was just difficult for her, right? But the missionaries continued to work with him in 6 months, right? And Mum tells the story that one day, it was a Saturday, and she was vacuuming, a very mundane thing. And then all of a sudden, it just came into her mind and her heart that it's true, it's true. And she talks about dancing around with the vacuum. It's true, it's true. And I'm thinking, gosh, that is hard for me to imagine with my mum, actually. Right, but they joined the church. They were in a small, dependent branch, right? So there was this handful of really strong, devout women who really carried that church along. We struggled, dependent, to have priesthood leadership for a branch president and things like that. That seemed to always be a struggle. I remember going to church in different halls, and one of them was the Scout Hall, and I remember we had to go and clean out all of the beer bottles before we could have church on Sunday, and just those kinds of things. But that sense of community was very strong, and that happens when it's such a small branch and you've got to rely on each other. I remember my mum and grandmother working all month to sew and to cook, to have enough stuff to have a stall every month so that we could afford to pay our bills for the church or for the telephone or for the lights or the telephone. And that was those days we had budgets and things like that. I remember my mother out there with a pick and a hammer, a pick, out there digging trenches for the church, right? In her late 40s, she's doing that. But that's what you do, right? Mm-hmm. She was, in a real sense, a pioneer. They were pioneers. And that had an impact on me.
Now tell me about yourself. How do you go from this branch that's very much on the fringes of the church to a place like BYU, which is right at the center of the church?
Yeah, there was some eye-opening things happening with that, and I was excited for it, right? I remember coming to BYU and that first devotional day and walking with thousands of people across to the Marriott Centre with the Carillion bells playing "Come, Come, Ye Saints." Well, I was in heaven on that. I remember those first opportunities to go to and listen to General Conference, whereas in Australia, you didn't get General Conference, the ensign, until 6 months after the fact. And I remember times of them trying to help us get conference earlier than that. So the first thing I remember is that they were going to play a session of conference over the telephone lines at church. And so we went because this was so exciting. But we were in a small branch and didn't have much money. We didn't have a very good sound system. So we heard and then a couple of words and then and that's all we heard. But none of us left because this is conference and this was our first experience with it, right? And it was so important to us. The next thing that I remember them doing is they bought some airtime on a radio station. And again, we gathered together around the radio on the Sabbath to listen to President Kimball, who was going to speak to us. And we're there, and the announcer says we're now about to listen from the Mormon prophet, Spencer W. Kimball. And then we hear, this is a test of the emergency broadcast system. And that's all we heard. The next time, it's, again, 6 months later, we're going to hear from President Kimball, and it was somebody put the wrong tape in, and so we heard Mormon Tabernacle Choir, which is fine, but when you're expecting the prophet, that's just doesn't quite do it. And so I remember the first time I came here to conference, and there was no way. In fact, my friend and I were backpacking around the world. This is before I came to BYU. But we were going to come and we were going to be here in conference. So we changed our itinerary to be here. And we got up early. This is in the fall conference, and it's cold. And remember, we're from the tropics. And we go down and get on the bus and go down to Temple Square. And we're in the tabernacle, and we're getting there. We got there so early. So we got up the top. And we got all crunched in and everything. President Kimball hadn't been to conference for a while. And so I wasn't really expecting, and there's all of this buzz going around, and then all of a sudden it was dead silence. And my friend and I looking around, what's happening? And we looked down, and there was President Kimball with D. Arthur Haycock on one side and President Hinckley on the other side, helping him in. And the feeling that I had then, that I still remember all of this time, what happens when the prophet of the Lord comes in. And he sat down there and he didn't say anything in conference that weekend, and that was the only session he came to. But I still remember the feeling of what it means to be in the presence of a prophet of God. And that has impacted me ever since, right? I try so hard that living here that I don't allow it to be conference to become second place, or not second place, but what's the word, common, and that I don't take it for granted. And I try very consciously to remember my experiences in Australia and how much we just hungered for that experience, and now it's so easy for me here.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Can I ask you another thing? You've talked a little bit about this too, but your experience as a single member of the church. You've mentioned there's so much in the church that's centered around family. Even our change in the way that we observed the Sabbath the last couple of years, President Nelson mentioned, was so that we could have more time with our families, or so that church could be easier for little children and things like that. As a single member of the church, tell us a little bit about your journey and how that you've been able to kind of negotiate that boundary of being in a church that emphasizes family so much, but being a single person.
Yeah, well, that's kind of a complicated experience. And honestly, my patriarchal blessing promises that the day will surely come when a righteous priesthood holder will desire to take me to the temple of the Lord, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. When that was pronounced upon me as a 17-year-old, I didn't think too much about it. Of course, that's going to happen. In my 20s, I started to think more about it, but I was here at BYU, and of course what happens at BYU, right? But nothing. My 30s, I started struggling, right? A patriarchal blessing's true. How can I have confidence in them? And dark times, right? How am I going to... Why not me? Doesn't the Heavenly Father love me as much as others? And so that was a real struggle for me. And honestly, it came to a point where I was at this, do I continue on with this or not, right? That choice. And as I honestly kind of struggled with this, I had to think, Gaye, is there a God? Absolutely. Does he love you? Yes, I couldn't deny that because of the experiences I've had with him. So I had to make the decision that I'm going to be in this, jump in with both feet, and that I don't understand that part of it, and I know they're eternal things and promises, but sometimes that doesn't stop the mourning, the here and now for lost possibilities. But I had to decide that because of those experiences that I choose God. I choose to be a part of his kingdom and to find ways to be a part. And that's one of the reasons why churches and that communal gathering is so important to me. Because it's important to me to stand shoulder to shoulder with other saints as I sing praises to God, as I partake of the sacrament, that this isn't just me against the world. This is me and this body of saints. Understanding that I'm not perfect, they're not perfect, and we're all in this struggle to do the best we can in our circumstances, and have that there is a place for me, even though I don't fit the norm. And that's one of the reasons, honestly, that I don't like being called a single sister, and I don't like being identified as a single person. What I want to be identified is I'm a member of the church. What am I going to do to make sure that I am active, not just in terms of active in church, but active in the process of being a part and a member of the church.
Any final thoughts you want to add to our discussion here?
I just think that for me personally, studying the ancients is a powerful way to help me better understand and nuance the things of the Sabbath, but in all things on the gospel. Their lives are so different from ours, but they're so much the same in so many ways. And this gospel is worth fighting for, this kingdom of God and being a part of it. And so I love to see them and their struggle, because it can relate to me and my struggle. And them saying this Sabbath day is so important to us that we cannot let this go. We've got to fight for it. And I think in our world, we're in a similar situation today.
Thank you for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of Religious Education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is Anthony Sweat. I'm the executive producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes, from BYU Religious Education, Professors Brad Wilcox, Casey Griffiths, and Ryan Sharp. Recording and mixing were done by BYU students Mitchell Bashford and Connor Miller. Say hi, Mitchell and Connor.
Hey, guys.
Hi.
Original music and scoring for Why Religion podcast was created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
and Alistair Scheuermann.
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion on wherever you get your podcasts, and leave us a rating. It really helps. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by Brigham Young University religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith.